Probably the most exciting thing I learned about the brain across a long career was that the brain has this capacity to adapt and change in order to meet whatever demands we're putting it under. The fancy technical word for that is neuroplasticity, and probably a lot of the people listening to this have heard of that. And what that means is that the brain can change functionally and structurally when we place certain demands on it. Much like the muscles in the gym. The more you lift, you stimulate those muscles, you're going to get hypertrophy, you're going to get improvements in power and strength and so forth. The more we exercise particular neural circuits, we give you some training in the area of attention, the more we work on that, the more efficient those circuits become. The neurons start to form stronger connections to one another. And we now know that even structural changes start to happen. They form more synapses. They exhibit more of this kind of fatty insulation that helps them conduct their impulses more quickly, myelin and so forth. And this is probably the single biggest discovery in brain science in the last 30 or 40 years has been that throughout our lifespan, and that's an important part, right? It isn't just in childhood, which we've known about for a very long time, but throughout our lifespan, our brain has this capacity to literally sculpt itself to perform the tasks that we practice better and more effectively.
What are your life experiences that have created the Scott Frey of today?
We could spend a very long time talking about this, but I'll cherry pick just a couple that I think have
Yeah.
been really formative. If you go to my website, there's a deeper explanation of some of this. I have a very different trajectory probably than most academic scientists that you'll meet. I dropped out of high school at age 16 and went to work full time to help support myself and my mom, who was had been a registered nurse but became disabled with multiple sclerosis. And so at age 16, I was working full time as a landscaper. Always had loved education, something that my mom and my grandparents really reinforced a lot with me, and started taking classes at the community college in the evenings. And then gradually, through a series of hard work and meeting a mentor, ended up going to the local four-year college and then on to Harvard for my graduate degree, my master's degree, and then on to Cornell for my PhD. Very unpredictable path. And what I like to tell people, and I asked my kids this once, how long do you think it was between when I dropped out of high school and when I got my PhD at Cornell? And I think they just kind of looked at me blankly. And I think my daughter said something like 25 years. And the answer is actually kind of funny. And it surprised me too when I did the math. It was 1 decade, 10 years.
Wow.
And so I think that the message there is that a lot can happen in a short period of time when we focus on process goals and sort of pick them off one at a time. And that's exactly what I did in my education. And the second part of the answer to your question is that at the same time that I launched my educational journey or my higher ed journey, I also launched my endurance sports journey. And so I discovered a love for running. When I signed up for that community college course, I also started running. And here we are, I guess 43 years later. I've not taken a break from doing some kind of endurance sport over those years. I was very sort of on the cusp of turning professional in triathlon in the early 90s, cross-country ski racing, running. Now it's bike racing and cross-country ski racing because I'm no longer a runner due to some chronic knee stuff. But the message for both of those things, I think, is that you have no idea where you can get to if you just start showing up and doing the work each day. And that's the very simple approach that I've taken to everything in my life where I've had the opportunity to achieve things. And I've also been very fortunate. I've had great people as role models and mentors along the way that have really helped me get to where I am. And so, yeah, that's my short answer to a long life.
So what about so where I'm curious is what about your combination between being in a athlete that did many triathlons beyond that long endurance training, long endurance running, and also your research that you done in your higher education career. What about the combination of the two led you to start cerebral performance?
Yeah, so great question.
Yeah.
My original degree was in experimental psychology. And so, experimental psychologists are the people who try to figure out how to quantitatively measure a variety of different mental activities, how we think, or cognitive abilities, consisting of things like decision making, memory, attention, perception, and so forth. They also study things like memory. They even study things like emotion and try to come up with tasks, behavioral tasks to investigate how those functions work and also to train those functions and look at the effects of that training. And so that was my initial background. And I really applied that to all of my research across the span of 30 years and several different universities. I was at Dartmouth College, I was at University of Oregon, and then I finished my career in 1993 at the University of Missouri. And in the 1990s, something really interesting happened soon after I got out of graduate school. We became able for the first time to peer into people's heads and see what circuits were engaged in those kind of behaviors that I was talking about. So we were, for the first time in history, able to look inside the human brain of a living person in a safe, non-invasive way, and really measure and look at the neural processes, the circuits in the brain that were creating things like attention, perception, emotion, memory. What was happening when people made decisions, and that sort of created a new field called cognitive neuroscience. And that was the field in which I really spent most of my career. So I directed two of these very sophisticated brain imaging centers in my career. At one at the University of Oregon, then one at the University of Missouri, had a large research team. And our focus was always on how do we make the connection between these mental faculties and human performance, human behavior, action in the
Mm.
world. And at the same time, in parallel, here I was out there very engaged in competitive athletics. And that ebbed and flowed. When I had my kids were little, it was difficult to race, but I never stopped some kind of training and always had a passion for it. And so as I was getting to the 30th year since my PhD, I was really having a sort of strong thirst to do something more applied in the world. You know, as a lab scientist, your career is teaching, training other scientists, and doing original research. And most of that original research culminates in peer reviewed publications. And we were very successful at doing that over the years. But I was kind of dismayed by the fact that a lot of the great discoveries coming out of my lab and many other labs were kind of going into the journals, going into the library, but not having impact that they might have out there in the real world. And so in my little focus on human performance, I was seeing a lot of things that I felt could really get traction with athletes and help them to really develop more than just the muscles and the cardiovascular system, but develop the brain in ways that would help to optimize their performance. And also seeing that that was a relatively overlooked part of training in sports science. So that sort of led me eventually to the point of closing up my lab, leaving my nice, secure, tenured position to start Cerebral Performance, where we're working pretty intensely with elite athletes one on one. I've got athletes in triathlon, in running, in cycling, very high level professional athletes, but also developing programs for athletes who are juggling the complexities of career and family in sport, like I did all those years. And we're really trying to focus on developing the brain systems.
No, what I was going to say is exactly like me. right? I'm that guy who's trying to juggle
Yeah.
career, trying to juggle athletics as well as family. So we'll get into my experience with it definitely.
Yeah. Great.
Um, but what you're telling me is that, like any other muscle, I could actually train my brain in some sort of, for referencing people lifting in the gym, series of overload, right? Progressive overload, where you're adding more and more weight to your, let's say it's your bench. I could do the same exact thing with my brain.
Yeah. I love that analogy because I think it helps to bring it into the realm of something we can all relate to.
Yeah.
The Probably the most exciting thing I learned about the brain across a long career was that the brain has this capacity to adapt and change in order to meet whatever demands we're putting it under. The fancy technical word for that is neuroplasticity, and probably a lot of the people listening to this have heard of that. And what that means is that the brain can change functionally and structurally when we place certain demands on it, much like the muscles in the gym, right? The more you lift, you stimulate those muscles, you're going to get hypertrophy, you're going to get improvements in power and strength and so forth. The more we exercise particular neural circuits, let's say attention, we give you some training in the area of attention, the more we work on that, the more efficient those circuits become. The neurons start to form stronger connections to one another. And we now know that even structural changes start to happen. They form more synapses. They exhibit more of this kind of fatty insulation that helps them conduct their impulses more quickly, myelin, and so forth. So we've learned, and this is probably the single biggest discovery in brain science in the last 30 or 40 years, has been that throughout our lifespan, and that's an important part, right? It isn't just in childhood, which we've known about for a very long time, but throughout our lifespan, our brain has this capacity to literally sculpt itself to perform the tasks that we practice better and more effectively.
So I'm going to reference this to simplify it for myself as well. So if I am simplifying neuroplasticity,
Hmm.
it's exercising my brain. Is that what I'm trying to really do and grow my brain?
Yeah, and I think one of the catchphrases here is neurons that fire together wire together. So when you're
Okay.
exercising your brain, you're getting those circuits to fire together.
Mm,
They start to wire together and they get to be more efficient. So yes, absolutely. And we're always exercising our brain. To take it to
okay.
the present context, you're listening to me talk and your listeners are listening to the conversation we're having. Presumably they're going to learn some new information here today. That learning is an example of neuroplasticity. Something changed in their brains as a result of this conversation. They had to form some kind of lasting memory based on the information that they're perceiving and making sense of. That's the kind of change we're talking about. Our brains are changed by experience, and we can take advantage of that by creating very structured training to optimize those systems that we want to develop to support some kind of performance, for example.
So, kind of like the next thing that I'm thinking about here is right.
Hmm.
I go and hit, you know, bench, whatever it is. Let's say it's 225. I'm pushing it that day. I can't go and hit that same weight the next day, right? I need some sort of recovery process. Is it the same thing with your brain, like that when you're working it, you're overloading it, you have some sort of mental fatigue involved?
Absolutely. So, one of the cool things that we've known now for over a century is that the amount of mental fatigue that we carry impacts our ability to do physical work. There were these great early experiments, and I won't get into kind of the nuances of them, but looking at inducing mental fatigue in people by giving them hard cognitive tasks to work on and showing that they could move less weight, effectively do less work, and that they needed time to recover from that. And so for athletes, that's a very actionable message, right? It says, if you're carrying a lot of mental fatigue, that's going to affect your physical performance in measurable ways. And we see it all the time. A big job I have with my athletes is getting them to not only rest their legs, but to also figure out ways we can get them to rest their brains in order to be peaking for a performance.
Interesting. So, how important is it when it comes to my physical performance that my brain, the impact that my brain physically has on it? Because I think there's totally days in the gym where I'm like, my body's ready to go, but my brain's necessarily not there, or vice versa. My brain is there and my brain is ready to go, but my body is physically sore, tired, not moving as much weight as I think.
Mhm.
So, how does that mental fatigue impact our actual physical performance in the gym or in really any sport, right?
Yeah. So putting a number on it's very difficult.
Yeah.
If we look at the even at those original studies, we could see that it varies across individuals, right? And it varies with some people are better able to cope with larger amounts of that mental fatigue before their physical performance starts to decline. In fact, when you and I start talking about some of the training that we experimented with together, one of the points of that training is to improve the fatigue resistance of those systems so that they can handle more fatigue in the heat of competition or in the heat of hard workouts. We'll get to that, I suppose. It's hard to put a number on the exact amount, but we know that this is happening because the systems in the brain that are being taxed by whatever kind of work you're doing mentally play a role in the kind of planning and execution of physical work as well. There's overlap in those systems. So if you think about it, if you're just got those systems rested and they're devoting their entire capacity to controlling your movements, maybe on the pickleball court, maybe in the gym, you've got all those resources pulling in one direction. But if you've now siphoned off some of those resources to deal with getting your taxes ready, or you're having conflicts in your personal life that are chewing up a bunch of energy, or you're working long hours overtime, whatever, those resources aren't going to be there. Those same brain systems are being taxed for two different purposes, and those two things have costs for one another.
So, the reason that I asked that question is because, and I'll go back to the gym reference because I think it's very easy to interpret and understand. And
Hmm.
then I'll relate it to pickleball afterwards too, and even other sports. But you have like your rate of perceived exertion. They call it RP, or you have your RIR. And that's really right after you do a set or any sort of load, you're interpreting how fatiguing that really was for you. Is there something to be said that sometimes my brain holds me back because I am mentally fatigued, but my body's ready to go?
Yeah, I think it's very clear at this point, and this comes out a lot in the context of the work that I do with endurance athletes. I think it's very clear that the limiter on performance that we bump up against immediately. Let me take like it's the holiday season. Maybe people were doing the turkey trot or they were doing the local, jingle bell run or whatever's going on. What holds them back from performing better? And we could think of a whole laundry list of things, their nutrition, their sleep, how much holiday partying they've been doing. All of that stuff is totally relevant. But what ultimately puts the brakes on your performance is the brain. The brain has evolved to put the brakes on and hold us back from getting anywhere near our absolute physiological limits. And that's a good thing, right? We don't want to get anywhere near putting ourselves in jeopardy, sacrificing our health, unless it's really a do or die sort of situation. And that's when wild things happen, like people lift up cars to get their kid out from underneath and things. And those are documented things. But most of the time, the brain's job is to slow us down and hold us back because the brain doesn't know that that little turkey trot you're doing is going to be over in 15, 20 minutes. It just experiences the feedback now from the muscles and your heart and your cardiovascular system saying, wow, this is a lot. It has no idea how long you intend to do this. And so it starts throwing warning lights up on your dash. And those come in the form of the thoughts. Damn, you're hurting yourself, Alec. Pull it back, right? Don't try and push the heavy weight today. Don't try and hold this pace any longer. The negative thoughts, all of the things are part of the warning lights that the brain throws up. We often talk about the brain acting like a kind of governor or a central governor that holds us back and doesn't allow us to get anywhere near the point of muscular failure. And so part of the work I do with athletes is helping to turn some knobs and pull some levers to help them get a little bit closer to their physiological limits, because there are tools that we can be using to do that, to kind of stave off that central governor a little bit.
So really that was what I was just going to ask you is like
Mhm.
what can we, because I think any athlete can relate to this, right? Even like let's say if it is pickleball, it's your 8th, ninth match of the day, right?
Mhm.
Your body is physically and mentally fatigued. And there things are rolling through your head that are telling you that you can't go any further, right? That I'm tired. I don't know if I could play another point. What can we do to break through those moments or even expand that capacity just a little bit longer to get us through that last match of the day?
Yeah. So in my one on one work with athletes, this is the goal, I would say, if there was a single goal. And the answer is multifaceted and depends a lot on the individual. We look at the total life and how can we optimize that in a way that will lower mental load and mental stress in a general sense. How can we lower the background stress levels and the mental fatigue, right? How can we, in addition, start to train performance critical brain systems to improve their capacity and efficiency and allow them to be able to perform better in those clutch moments when you are fatigued? So, taking the case of for example, professional cyclists. I work with professional cyclists who race these incredible races. People watch the Tour de France, things like this, right? They might be 4 hours into a stage riding through the Pyrenees, and they're exhausted, they're on the limit, but that's when the critical decisions go down and people have to make their moves, and that's when the races are won or lost. By training things like attention, decision making, impulse control, we hope to improve their capacity so they can handle more of that fatigue and still be functioning at a more optimal level. And that's applies not only to the kind of sports that have been my focus, but certainly apply to things like the high speed ball sports that you're discussing.
Yeah, because where I reference pickleball is just like the actual processing that needs to occur, especially
Mhm.
when you're up at the kitchen, you're close to the net, your opponent is literally 14 feet away from you. That decision making has to be quick. And if you are in your way at all throughout the match, you're going to lose it. And the second piece of that is that the matches, I think we talked about this briefly before, the matches are 3 games. However, each game is only to 11 points. So 4 points in, you're over a third of the way through that game, and the chance of recovery is tough, right? Because it's not like you have 4 quarters, right? You don't have an hour to get back in the game. Most matches on average are anywhere to 15 to 30 minutes. So, is there another piece of this, and this is where you're diving into the uniqueness of your sport, where you're looking to dial it in at, let's say, an RPE 10 for that 15 minutes
Yeah.
rather than an endurance athlete is really trying to maintain, right? An RPE 10 is a little bit different for them when they're trying to do it longer term, right? It's literally, there's probably a piece of energy conservation in there, right?
Hmm.
Trying to figure out what points, like in the cyclist, what points in the race that you need to turn it up. But in pickleball, it's quick. It's like, how can I do this at the highest level in a short period of time? What's the
Yes.
difference look like in training like that?
Yeah. So I think in the case of pickleball, it's
Yeah.
like taking those crux moments where,
Mm.
a runner on the track might be there might be two or three moments in a 5,000-meter race on on the track where they've got to really react quickly to an opponent's move. And the same in a long stage like a stage race like the Tour de France. There are crux moments punctuate this big endurance space. Pickleball is just those crux moments. Tennis is just those crux moments. Basketball kind of consists of just those crux moments. And as we talked about pickleball and you educated me a little bit, I really started to appreciate, Alec, some things I had no idea about, but that in a sense, those crux moments have almost no space at all between them in pickleball. Like it's just crux moments. And so I got super excited when we were having that conversation because I was thinking, wow, this is an area where the kind of things that I'm doing with my endurance athletes have potential for even greater impact because of the nature of the speed, decision making, attentional demands, focus, perception, all of that is being so dense in your sport. And so I think the training the logic and the science behind the training is the same. And I should emphasize, I'm a scientist. I'm coming from a science background. I'm, cerebral performance is something I started to bring that science into action, and that's why I'm doing this kind of work. There's a good body of science. People can go to my website, cerebralperformance.com, and they can look. And I'm constantly updating that with the newest science. But we would want to be taking you and training, say, critical attention and decision making systems, for example, which is what I had you work on, where you're responding very rapidly, you're having to make quick decisions under pressure, and trying to get you to do that when you're already fatigued from training. So try to get you as close as possible to the context of being in the middle or end of that game, of that match, right? Where things are you're tired, you're on the limit, you're at 10, and training those systems to be sharp and be able to hold it together for every point, every point. That's where we want to get you.
I will tell you because we're kind of leading into it, so we'll dive into my experience now. I will tell you that a lot of those exercises, pretty much all of them, are not easy, especially the first time around. But the small intricacies of what your brain starts to do is super cool. But it also led me a little bit in the wrong direction sometimes. So, for example, one that I noticed was like my brain was trying to be super predictive, meaning you start going through this. So, some of them were 10 minutes long. So, you can imagine you're tapping on a screen for 10 minutes. I'll get into the details of what it is. So, your attention needs to be very, very, very good,
Mhm.
especially because every, I'll say, half a second or less, there's something on the screen that you need to do. The second piece of that is that when you're cycling through a couple of these exercises and they're pattern based, my brain was trying to be predictive. However, sometimes it was being so predictive that it led me to the wrong series of tapping that I needed to do, whether it was left side of the screen or right. But it's so cool how you can see because you don't have enough time to really think. You're just kind of doing. At the beginning, you're thinking and then you're just doing. It's really cool to see how your brain is adapting over that series live. If you could stay aware during it, you could literally watch your brain do that as you're going through the trainings. But with my experience as well, I wanted you to dive into a little bit of detail of how the different trainings
Mhm.
were impacting my brain in different manners because some of them were completely different patterns. Some of them were to explain one of them. I'll give you the best visual for audio people. Left button on the bottom of the screen. There's a button that said tap left. There was one that said tap right. An arrow, a directional arrow, popped up on the screen anywhere. However, it pointed left or it pointed right. So where your brain would get a little bit confused sometimes, and then it started to adapt, was if it put a left arrow on the right side of the screen, your brain originally is like, oh, it's on the right side of the screen, right. But it's not true because the arrow is pointing left. So over that period of time, your brain is now quickly trying to recognize, okay, that is not a right arrow. It's actually a left arrow on the right side of the screen. So I need to tap left. So that's at least the most simplistic one I could do. At least speak out loud. That's a good visual. But tell me why some of these patterns, there were sequences, there was even the red light at the top that was random in the middle. I really want to know why that was a piece of it. So get me into a little bit of what these different patterns are and how they are physically training your brain.
Yeah. So I love that you chose the task that you chose. And I'm going to come
Okay.
around to that in a second. I'm going to
Okay.
give you just a tiny bit of the theory, and then we'll talk about the practical application. So,
Okay.
what I did is I set Alec up with 3 sessions of what we call brain endurance training. More information, you can check the website. I try to keep it keep accessible information there for people about this who are interested. What I had you focus on was a chunk of a larger mesocycle of training. We structure our training into these kind of big cycles and then smaller cycles within it. And you were in a micro cycle or a week long cycle where you did 3 sessions over the course of the week on separate days. And those sessions I chose were to focus on one of the fundaments of all kind of quick moving decision making ball sports. Decision making and attention. Those are the key elements. And also, by having you do those tasks, we're inherently training your ability to quickly perceive a stimulus on the screen, a visual stimulus, and to respond really quickly. That's going to engage the following things. We've got this something called the dorsal attention network in the brain. And when I was running the brain imaging centers, we could map that. If we had brought you in and did the tasks that you described, we'd see this activation going from the back of your brain to the front of your brain in this particular network of areas. We're exercising those and making those more efficient. Remember, I was saying areas that fire together, wire together, neurons that fire together, wire together. We're making those circuits more efficient. And by training them in the context of you being fatigued from doing your practice ahead of time, which is one of the things we do a lot with our athletes, we're trying to build that capacity and fatigue resistance into them. That dorsal attention network is the one that we control, where we pay attention to things. So when that arrow comes up, you intentionally devoted your attention to that. That's dorsal attention network. Ventral attention network is captured when something appears quickly, like the sound in the bushes, all right? It grabs our attention. That's part of this too. We're training that as well because you never know where that arrow is going to pop up, right? And so it's capturing your ventral attention network. You're directing all your resources to it with the dorsal attention network. Then you've got to make a decision. And that decision making is evolving other areas, a lot of our big prefrontal cortex in the front of our head. So we're engaging all of these circuits. And you're going through, as you said, you're doing this for 5, 10 minutes. You're just busting it, trying to focus and maintain that attention. We're exercising those circuits just like you're doing reps in the gym on the bench, or just like you're working on playing on the court with an opponent. Repetition leads to improvement, and that's exactly what we're doing there. So that task is a really good one for training attention and decision making, and also response inhibition. So when you saw that arrow pointing to the left, but it appears on the right side of the screen, the automatic thing that gets engaged is, oh, it's on the right. I should hit the right button. You've got to inhibit that and go and hit the left button, right? You've got to override that impulse to respond. That's all the time happening in the kind of sports you're wanting to play at this high level that you do, right? You are predicting, to take your word, what your opponent is going to do as well, right? That there's a pattern to the play. You're trying to anticipate in order to be there and be able to return more quickly what that opponent's about to do. And sometimes you'll be right and then you have an advantage, but sometimes you'll be wrong and you'll have to inhibit it and go the other way. So that's the logic behind what we're doing.
So to give you that small piece in my experience where like just me
Yeah.
doing it live,
Hmm.
That same scenario, I started to notice my right so I was had both thumbs on the screen. I started to notice my right thumb twitch but not press and then switch to my left.
Yeah.
Noticing exactly what you're talking about, that, like, literally inhibiting me from doing it. It's like my
Mhm.
brain wanted to do it, but quickly recognized, not correct. Then
Right.
click the left thumb, right? But my right thumb still every so often would twitch in that scenario, but it wouldn't fully press. So it was super interesting where I went from tapping it to just a quick twitch of like, not supposed to do that, and then click the left one. Now
Yeah.
you got into audio a little bit too.
Hmm.
So there was one training exercise in there. I'll tell you, this is the one that was the most challenging for me. It was the most frustrating too. There was one in there where you had to the numbers are popping up on the screen once again for audio, and we'll put this on here for visuals too.
Okay.
Numbers are popping up on the screen right in the center, and you have to recognize if the pattern, the sequence of numbers, is either three even numbers in a row or three odd numbers in a row. Now, if you get lost, you have to jump back in. But the other thing is like trying to jump back in and refocus in order to get your pattern back. That was a challenging piece of it. However, every time you got one wrong, it went, "Arr." You got another one. "Arr." So obviously, you brought up the audio aspect of it. Why is that also important when it comes to brain, the recognition and actually training the brain?
Yeah. So knowing that we only had a limited amount of time together, I threw the kitchen sink a little bit at you, man. And you did a great job, by the way. I should just share that
I
with
gave my
you.
best
And your,
effort.
no, you did great. So, what's one of the most important things to master in a sport like you're engaged in at this high level? It's not dwelling on your errors, right? I mean, it sounds to
Mm,
me, given the pace of your play, that if you make an error, boy, if you dwell on that, all of a sudden you're just amplifying that error into the next point, the next point, the next point. You've got to be able to quickly switch away from that. Boom, done. On to the next thing, right? Be you can't be fixated on what just happened. You've always got to be present in the moment, and so that task was really designed to get you to do that. And the audio feedback, which I did add in there, was to just add that little bit more pressure and stress to the whole thing
mm.
because we're trying to train as closely as we can these systems to the way you'll be using them in high performance play.
So I will tell you that when I first started doing them, when you hear the right, it
Yeah.
uh it throws you off to what you're getting at of like, then I missed a couple more. And you're right, it's the same thing in any sport on the pickleball court, tennis, whatever it is. If you can't quickly jump back in, it's more than likely going to lead to another miss. And this is where a lot of athletes talk about compounding misses, right?
Oh yeah.
It's
All the
like
time.
all the time. You have that first miss, and all of a sudden you have two, three, four. And in pickleball, this is what I'm getting at is like in pickleball, if your one miss leads to two, three, or four, that's over a third of the game gone,
You're
right?
done.
You're done. So I noticed that in that exercise, because it's going so fast,
Mhm.
that it forces you to jump back in.
Right.
Regardless of having an error, you're forced to wash it away.
Exactly. And that was my intention for you. I tried
Yeah.
to choose things that I thought would be really relevant to what you're trying to develop. And it's relevant to so many things. You know, think about a ski racer.
Hmm.
They don't ski a perfect line around a gate in a slalom. They can't be thinking about that or they're done too, right? They're into the
Yeah.
gate, they're into the fence or whatever. A race car driver or it may be hard for people to understand how it applies to the endurance sports, but it really does as well. Um, so what I think
Yeah.
is really cool about this is the stuff you're describing in your firsthand account really when I hear this as someone who is trained in this area, I'm hearing what exactly was the desire and the intent of these tasks, and that the more you get practiced on that, the more we can train this skill of recovery and getting back into the moment. So you jumped in with a week of training, And imagine this, and it may be hard to appreciate this, but I can see in your data you'd be great. You started in at a low intensity, and then we're going to progress that intensity just like we would with any kind of training. The
Mm.
next week we ramp it up a little bit. The next week we ramp it up a little bit. And in the fourth week, I ramp it way down. We have a recovery week. And you had brought up recovery earlier. And so that's a microcycle. And that fits in a larger mesocycle of training. So then we would start another microcycle where we start you with new tasks, low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity, and drop back. And this isn't simple in it, like training any athlete at a high level is complicated. We can all go out and get free information off the internet and download a program and run a couch to 5K. And I don't mean to dismiss that, but when we're looking at high performance athletes like yourself, there's individualization that has to play in here. So if we were working together,
Absolutely.
I would be going through your data now and building a program for next week based exactly on that data. I'd look at the things that you did really well at, and there were many, and I would be looking at the areas where I saw opportunity to build more strength, and I would be focusing on those in the coming weeks. And so we build this strong foundation, and then we have this individualized specialization aspect to it as well.
Is there something to be said as well about, and because I'm only making the reference to like physical training too.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say once again, if it is pickleball, tennis, but pretty much any athlete, right? You have your peak events
Mm-hmm.
throughout the year because you can't be 100% in every event that you play. So a lot of athletes
Right.
choose those events that they want to peak at.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same process as you just mentioned of like, we are going to progressively overload into your peak events, and then we're going to make sure that we're deloading or having the proper recovery right before that big event?
Yeah, your intuition is generally right on here. Usually, the way it is with my one-on-one clients is we build out a plan for the year, just like they might with their coach. Right? We
Mm,
have a training plan that has a base phase where we're working on developing a broad foundation. Then we move into a pre-competitive phase where we're starting to really then start to focus on particular areas that they can develop and improve in, and we're maintaining that volume but we're adding more intensity, and that's individualized. And then before they once they get into the competitive season, before especially before the big events where they're kind of like their A level events as opposed to B or C level events that they might just do for part of their training, we're going to dial back the volume. We're going to leave some intensity, but now it's going to be designed to provide activation to warm up those systems before they step onto the court. Uh, so, in that
gotcha.
way, I think it mirrors very well a physical training plan.
So there was two other pieces of this plan, and you just set me up perfectly for it that I wanted to get into.
Cool.
The first piece is that the way it was organized, you mentioned one piece, which makes total sense, of meaning
Mm-hmm.
you wanted to do it after I already had a heavy lift or massive amount of exercise, to the point of like you're training to break through that barrier of that ninth, 10th, or last match that you're in, right? When you already are mentally fatigued.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece that I want to know a little bit more about is you did have me do a pre and a post exercise
Oh yeah.
right in the middle of all of those trainings that I did. So, what is the reason that you had the pre and the post? Is it like a warm up you would do in the gym, like a stretch or like a little
Yeah.
jog, get the blood flowing? Same thing.
It's partly that. It serves that function. It serves one other function. So,
Yeah.
what Alec is describing here is imagine the simplest task possible, right? No decisions to be made. You're just waiting. A little object comes up on the screen and you just tap it as quickly as you can. It is basically giving me a measurement for how quickly you can conduct a signal from the eye to those visual centers in the brain to the motor centers in the brain, send an impulse down your spinal cord and out through the peripheral nerves in your arm to get your
Hmm.
finger to move. It encapsulates that time, right? that time is a reflection of how efficient that central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, are operating. And so when you're under a lot of mental fatigue, Alec, the that time will be longer. And one of the things in your data that I saw is that it was bouncing around. When you were working really hard on my tasks, you would be a little bit. So we give that task at the beginning, and then we do the training that Alec was describing, and then we repeat that task at the end. And by comparing the beginning and the end, the kind of bookends of your training session, we could say, how much mental fatigue did we induce with the training that we had you do in between? And you were holding up really, really well until the last session, your final day, where the final day you showed a massive spike in the mental fatigue. Your ability to conduct that signal from essentially the eye to the hand went way up. It probably increased by about 50%. And that's a
Okay.
signal to me that we've pushed the limit. He needs recovery now. So that is a way of estimating fatigue in the central nervous system, and then it helps me to better tune things. But you're absolutely right. It's a great way of pre-competition, pre-training activation as well.
So, so that makes so much sense now because you're basically going in and you're getting a little bit of a baseline of where we are today, and then afterwards getting it in comparison. So, and the task was very easy as you just talked about. It really was just warming you up. It was just a light popped up in the middle of the screen, and you had to tap it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and we
The
get a
sec,
lot of information. And as I work
yeah,
with athletes over weeks and months, right, I start to see patterns in that. Oh, look, their physical training is really getting very intense. They're training a lot of hours right now. I'll start to see that the times that it takes to do that simple task start to creep up, and that's an alert for me to let them or their coach know that you might be getting close to the limit. You might need to dial it back a little bit. They might need a little more recovery, or they're not sleeping well, or their nutrition is off. It's a way of really looking at fatigue in the brain and spinal cord, the central nervous system.
that's actually a whole piece that I didn't even think of. Is that's such an easy way for you to be able to communicate to the rest of their coaching staff physically, whether it's your tennis coach on top of your trainer, be able to communicate to them of like what state your brain is physically in that training cycle. That's actually huge.
It
Because
is huge.
I feel like a lot of times as an athlete, you walk into the sessions and your coach wants you to do the work anyways,
Mhm.
but doesn't necessarily know the state that you're in that day. So they
Yeah,
give
I
them
think it's
real deep insight.
right. I think it's the first time that we've had some way of quantitatively measuring that. And,
Yeah.
uh, subjective data is super important. How an athlete feels. We spend a lot of time talking about their perceptions and how they're feeling in the one-on-one work, but this quantitative measure, how many thousandths of a second, right, milliseconds. It might take you a third of a second or 333 milliseconds to make perform one of those, just one iteration or one trial of a task. There's a lot of information in there too. And we're able to now have that quantitative data to supplement the subjective reports that people are sharing with us. And man, it's so interesting for me to see. I can see these athletes starting to develop these patterns. And if it's 1 or 2 days, I'm like, maybe not anything. But when it starts to be 3 days and they're looking like, whoa, that mental fatigue, they're getting slower, slower, slower,
Mm.
red light. And if we ignore it every time, we start to see what happens is like they need a longer break. They get tired, they get injured, something like that happens. And I say injured because, you know, if your brain's not functioning well in some of the sports that I work with people, like a cyclist or a skier, you're at higher risk of injuring yourself. We can also
I can
see, and this is going to be an interesting thing in sports that are where there's a high susceptibility of concussion. Um, this is another way of looking at the recovery process from that, and that's something that we'll be developing more in the future as well.
I'd be interested in that. I don't know how deep you're into that process, but you can imagine any physical sport. So my background was hockey. I know
Hmm.
that the
Big concussion sport.
big concussion sport. So I can see where that would not only have a heavy impact when it comes to the feedback on an athlete to be able to actually take rest, but
Hmm.
also just the reassurance to the athlete that they're doing the right thing. Because
Yeah.
I think as an athlete, the tough thing is that like you're so lost in how you're feeling, as you
Oh
just
yeah.
mentioned.
Hmm.
But the subjective data that allows you to say, like, hey, this is exactly the state that my brain is in. It does need a rest. It's telling me it needs a rest, or my body as a whole. That gives an athlete such peace of mind, if I'm being
Yeah.
honest with you.
No, for sure.
Uh,
And that's a part of the puzzle that's not been available to us. Concussion super complicated. The trajectory of recovery is super complicated. We've not had a good way to predict that or evaluate that in a quantitative way. I mean, there
okay.
are some tasks we can give people and so on. I think this adds additional information that can be helpful there. But in a more general sense, I think it really does track nicely with people's levels of readiness to train,
Mm.
generally speaking. And if we're tired and we're carrying a lot of mental fatigue, it's going to affect your performance. And it also means that you're not ready to absorb the training.
How much, I don't know if
Mhm.
you can put a percentage on this from some of the research that you've done, but how much does that mental fatigue actually impact your physical performance? Pickleball, endurance, etc. Like,
Yeah.
what does that impact actually look like?
Yeah, I wish I could put a number on that, and I
Yeah.
and I really can't. I think when I was mentioning earlier that there's been a lot of research on mental fatigue and physical performance where people have done everything from showing that giving people a bunch of mentally fatiguing tasks and then bringing them into the lab and having them, you know, lift weight or do work on a cycling ergometer or something like that is compromised, right? How much it's compromised again is going to be individually variable. But
Mm.
if you go to my website, there are a couple of papers on there, but there's much larger literature out there about these effects. I just can't put a number on it. But what I can say is that when you're a high level athlete, you work incredibly hard to get a 1 percentage point improvement, right? And even if this is just let's say you're not massively impacted, but you're 1% or maybe only a fraction of a percent impacted. That's the difference between winning or losing in at least with the athletes that I primarily work with, and I'm sure it's true at your level of play as well. So I think that's an underestimation to the impact of these things. But let's take a worst case scenario and say it's just 1%. How hard would you have to work to improve your game 1% at this point?
Very hard.
Yeah, and for
Very
my
hard.
athletes, when we
And that's the
talk about
difference.
yeah, when we talk, some of the athletes I work with, the difference between, 0.5% is a national championship or not, or being on the podium at a World Cup or not.
Yeah, because in retrospect, what I'll kind of give you with referencing playing pickleball is that you get to a point where just about everybody can hit all the shots. But now, like you just mentioned, it's that awareness, anticipation of two aspects of it.
Hmm.
Reading your opponent, right? But also deceiving your opponent. So that's where you're now not only one step ahead, but two. Meaning you're not only anticipating what they're going to do, but you're also almost how do you want to call it? Thinking of a different word, but let's stick with deceiving. You're moving your body knowing that they're going to, let's say, speed up at your chest. You're going to leave your chest open or look open so that they put the ball there anyways, right? So that being two steps ahead. So for me, that half a percent, that 1% now, it's not that the skill's not there. It's those 1 or 2 percentages that are going to separate me from here to the top that allow me to play at the highest level. And you see that over and over again, right? Because the greatest example is you have some very, very great tennis athletes coming over into pickleball.
Hmm.
They're usually pretty solid in the singles game. Now, but where it's different at the top, right? So some guys can come in and be what is considered a 5-0, and usually consider like a 6-0 plus a pro. 5-0 to 6-0 is like the semi-pro level. Those guys come in immediately good at singles. Why do they have trouble breaking into the top 10 or the top 20? It's that 1%, right? It's the anticipation, it's the awareness on top of that of what people are doing. It's not that they don't have the skill to do it, but the difference is those 1 or 2%. The reason that I wanted to ask that question, and I'm glad that you gave actually a great reference to it, is just the actual impact that mental fatigue can have on your physical performance. And me, truly, uh, it probably has the most impact on me as a whole. The reason being is because I am someone who is super emotionally in tune with myself just by my nature.
Hmm.
It plays in my favor often, but also plays against me. So where it plays in my favor is I can usually get myself pretty revved up to perform. On
Hmm.
the other half of things, though, the swing in the other direction is also times where, like, when I don't want to go do it, it's very challenging for me to actually
Yeah,
get myself in that position to go do it.
sure.
So it's more about the swing. So being able to actually subjectively look at something like this is very
Hmm.
impactful for me as an athlete.
Yeah, what you point out is so interesting, and I would rephrase something you said earlier a little bit differently. Like
Go for it.
you've got all of this, you've got your limited cognitive resources, and I want to stress that point. We're having this conversation because we don't just have an unlimited amount of resources for attention,
Mm,
decision making, responding, perception. It is limited, right? If you're using it, you're focusing on the game, and now you're going to have to use some of it to essentially do a lot like what you were describing. Look at that leftward pointing arrow on the right side of your screen and do a that's kind of like a little bit like doing a fake, except the task was trying to do a fake on you. You're trying to now do that on your opponent. That's requiring some very quick decision making and some very, very demanding of cognitive resources kind of play there, strategic play, right? If you're able to improve your capacity just a little bit for decision making, attention, response inhibition, you're not going to compromise your play to the same degree you will in a situation like that. So, part of building more capacity into these systems is not only making them more fatigue resistant, but also making them better able to manage that subtle complexity you're describing where you're having play, but you're still having the resources to play strategically. Big
So am I
difference.
looking so am I looking at to build off you touch, am I looking at my brain capacity as almost like a gas tank? Where right now, let's say I have a 16-gallon tank and I'm looking to expand it to 17 gallons, right?
Yeah, I've often used like a water bucket analogy, but that works
Okay.
really well. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You've got your 16-gallon tank. If we could have a 17-gallon tank, you're going to get a lot further down the road. We're
And like
not,
you
and
mentioned,
let's be honest, we're not talking about giving you a 32-gallon tank.
yeah.
If someone starts making promises like that, you should really run the other way and get a tight grip on your wallet. We're not talking about replacing training. We're talking about complementing training. We're talking about an additional thing to do to get you from that high level to the highest level. And that, I do think that there's a lot of value in this training for people who are at all levels of sport. I think we really neglect
Absolutely.
training the brain. It's not in the circle of specialties that we normally think of as sports science, and that's a really missed opportunity. So I do work with athletes at other levels. We're starting some group programs that are going to help to make this kind of training available, along with the other contextual support and education in the new year. So I think this is something I'm quite excited about, bringing this kind of stuff to athletes who aren't at the pointy end of the spear.
So I completely agree with that. Even from like my standpoint, the reason that I think about that is because we'll keep using the gym reference because I think it's easy to understand, like I
Oh
said.
yeah.
Um, we talked about the mentally fatiguing side and how it affects performance, but the other way is how it affects performance in the positive manner, right? What you just talked about. So let's say I'm someone starting my gym journey, right? And now right, it's the new year. A lot of people step foot in the gym come the new year.
Mhm.
If I'm able to, and you could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm thinking about using the gas tank reference, if my brain is able to expand from 16 gallons to 17 gallons, I'm now saying, well, if I have 3 sets or 3 exercises to do that day, I'm going to fatigue or mentally fatigue after two rather than after one. Meaning, if I was going into the gym and I only had a 16-gallon tank, after that first bench exercise, I'm a little mentally tired. And then my effort into my second exercise, which may be lat pull downs, may be less than it was on bench. So this is where the way I think about it is if my actual gas tank, my brain capacity is greater, well,
Mhm.
now I will not mentally fatigue after bench or after those lat pull downs. I'll even continue that possibly into my third exercise. Is that like a solid reference on that?
I think it's great. And so
Yeah,
to take it just that one step farther, so what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence is now that you actually are getting more out of that training session. You're getting more stimulation. And as a consequence of that, over time, your fitness is going up. So we're addressing the brain part
exactly.
of it, but your physicality, right, is improving because we're allowing you to go that much deeper, that much further. And over time, that really adds up into better physical conditioning and fitness and performance. So
Hmm.
the big picture here is it's such a missed opportunity to be leaving the brain out of the equation and just training the muscles, the legs, the cardiovascular system, the metabolism. You got to do it all if you want to perform at whatever your best is. And I think most of us, no matter what level we're at in sport, we want to perform as well as we can. I mean, go watch the people at the turkey trot. Very few of them just are there and don't care at all how it goes, right? They may be people that only run once a year at the turkey trot, but they're still trying. Or people step on the pickleball court brand new to it. We have a desire as human beings to want to do well. And if we're not training the brain as well as the body, we're really missing an opportunity to do that.
Yeah. And like I think about two as kind of like building on this, even with if it is the amateur or the professional, um, attentive focus level also allows you to, I'll say, move more weight in the gym, right?
Right,
Or run a little bit faster at the end of your race. And the
right.
reason that I reference that is because something that I actually did, and you could tell me if I'm crazy for this, but in the gym, I started removing my headphones, working out with no headphones,
Oh, yeah.
because I don't get headphones on the pickleball court. So what I notice is that my attentiveness in the gym is higher because I'm drowning out the outside. But you go to the pickleball court and now all the noises are loud, right? People are talking, and your brain kind of gets scrambled, and you can't really think much because you have this environment that you're not used to. So what I started doing was working out without my headphones in, literally headphoneless. And then I noticed my attention got higher, and then my lifts got higher because of my actual attention to the task that I was doing. So I could see this being a whole nother level of now you increasing that attentiveness. So not only are you moving more weight, but you're doing it for a longer period of time. And therefore your growth in the positive direction, the impact that you're having on your performance in the positive direction is, I don't know, I can't put a number on it, but I would say it's at least double, right?
Yeah.
It's at least 2x what you were doing.
It's super interesting. To take it to your headphone example, yeah,
Yeah.
I prescribe with my athletes if they're people who are really habitually training, with headphones, I ask them to take them out and at least
Okay.
limit their use for the very reason you're describing. And I think the next level thing that I would tell you if we were working
Tell me.
together is I want you to take one of your microphones that you use for your podcast and your laptop to a pickleball match and record all the background sounds and start listening to that some of the time through your earbuds when you're
Mm,
training.
I love that idea. I will be doing that. I absolutely will be
I
doing that.
think it would be next level, and I think that it again
Huh.
is all of the learning that we do in this, 100 years of psychology plus has told us this is highly contextual.
Yeah.
So if you want to get good at something, you not only need to train it, but you need to train it in as similar conditions to those as in which you want to perform optimally as possible. So a next level move for you, man. Probably shouldn't have leaked it out on the podcast because now all your competitors are going to be out there doing it. I'm
I
just
know.
kidding.
I need that edge.
I think you should do it. I think it could actually be very advantageous.
I will absolutely be doing it, and then I will get back to you with the feedback. But I'm
I love it.
me doing the step with the headphones. I can't see it not working. Right?
No,
Like
I don't.
there's
I
like
think it.
it can only do better.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a series of podcasts and still have more to talk about on the
Yeah.
effects of dividing your attention between two
Mm,
different things. And this is such a huge thing in our society, right? We're because we're in the information age and we've got powerful computers in our pockets. Our attention is so divided now. We're always like sending a text, having a conversation, and thinking about an argument that we just had or something all at the same time. That has consequences. We're seeing it, study after study. Peer reviewed high quality stuff is showing that we're changing how our attention systems function due to the nature of our daily life. And so how can that applies to athletes and to everybody else? So how can we start to address some of that and get the attention back to being optimal in an athletic performance situation, for instance, and doing the kind of things we've been talking about is one way forward. Yeah, take
how
the
can
headphones out at least
talk
some of the
kind
time. But yeah,
build building on that? Really, what I wanted to ask you is if it is an athlete, but if it is just daily life, right? We consume a lot of social media these days, a lot of outside information, and that in reference totally would tell me it's filling my brain capacity. It's filling that gas tank, right? So what can we possibly do throughout the day to if we're working towards expanding the gas tank and let's say we only have the 16 gallons, what can we really do to offload or free up some of that current capacity in order to use it elsewhere?
yeah. So the reality for many of us, if you're not a professional athlete, you don't have as much control over that as a professional athlete might. And even
Mm,
the professional athletes I work with, there are expectations for many of them to do things on social media all the time. So what I'm going to tell you what I tell them, and I
yeah.
think it applies more generally to the rest of us that have busy lives that we're juggling. Look at everything you're doing in a general sense. You can do this just sitting around over a cup of coffee and think of what can you let go of. Can't let go of your kids, probably can't let go of your job, all of those things. But if you're heading into a big competition, your A game, right? Your A race, whatever it happens to be, I bet you can let go of social media for 3 days. I bet you can do that. Um, Letting go of that alone can have a massive impact on lowering your mental fatigue. You don't have to do it for a month. I mean, it might be great. You might love it and you might find like, whoa, I have so much more energy and time. But that's a low hanging fruit, I think, for many of us to just say, let people know, you're coming back, whatever, if that's necessary, but this is really important to me, and so for the next 3 days don't expect me to have a presence. I think this is a really big deal, and I think we're really underestimating the impact it has on performance. You could probably some people, younger athletes I work with are big gamers, right? They're even the pros, they've got a lot of time, they're traveling, they're gaming. Great. How about we dial that back for the week of your big event too? Because that's mental load that you can sacrifice and you don't need. How about we replace some of that with some lower stress activities? I prescribe often, based on science, some kind of mindfulness, some kind of meditative work. I know everywhere you turn, mindfulness, meditative work. My versions of this are often quite simplified, but there is really good data that these have an impact on the brain that is positive in supporting the kind of adaptations we're talking about. So I think we can all find ways to weed the garden a little bit without completely dropping the ball, and that can have a big difference in how we perform.
From your experience with your athletes, and maybe this is the best reference that we can give, is I'm trying to quantify the actual impact that social media has on loading your brain. Because you can imagine, I even think of my younger cousins. I even think of myself sometimes getting in the habit, right? I'm going on and trying to make a post and I find myself scrolling again for another 30 minutes. I'm like, Jesus, you know?
Yeah. No, all the
But it's
time.
like,
Me too.
what's the actual impact, the actual load that social media has on your brain capacity?
So my best answer to this is there was a study. I think it's probably 3 years ago now, where
Okay.
they had some kind of physical work measure. I can't remember what it was. Was it weightlifting or putting out power on a cycling ergometer or something? It was some quantitative measure of physical work. Okay. And they did a really pretty study where they randomly assigned people to two conditions. In one condition, they were doing social media for half an hour before the workout. And in the other, they were just passively watching something, Netflix or something, right? Where they weren't engaging in the same way that we do, that's so attentionally demanding and maybe even emotionally demanding, depending on what we're doing with social media. And they got a very clear distinction in performance on the physical work that people were able to do. The social media group showed a reduction in their capacity that wasn't shown by the people who did this more passive activity. So am I telling you go out and just stare blankly at a screen, watch what my mom would have called the boob tube when we were kids? No, I'm not necessarily saying that, but I am saying that we should all take a look and be a little intentional in how we're using that limited cognitive resource, particularly when we're heading into a period when we want to be performing optimally.
So you once again building on that, you mentioned meditation or mindfulness, and yes, it's definitely overused, but I think the key piece that you had in there was that you can keep it super simple. You
Super
don't have
simple.
you don't have to overcomplicate it. Can you
No.
give us a few of those simple things that you prescribe to your athletes?
Yeah, I can, and I'll tell you just why I do it because I always like big part of what I do with my athletes is I never just ask them to do something without telling them why I'm asking them. So
I love that.
when I was running the brain imaging center at the University of Oregon, there was a scientist who was visiting, and he was interested in studying the effects of a mindfulness practice on the brain. And so he recruited a bunch of college undergrads who were going to come and they were going to get this training of how to do this kind of mindfulness exercises. Nothing really particularly fancy, for something like 15 minutes 3 times a week. And then he was going to scan the brain before and after and also look at a bunch of measures of how well they could focus attention and their level of anxiety and all of these things. And honestly, I was the director of the brain imaging center. Then I thought, man, people bring all sorts of studies to me and want my feedback. And I'm looking at this one and I'm thinking, there is no way in hell this study is going to work. Right. I looked at it, but it was a well designed study and he had put a lot of thought into it. There were, scientifically, it was rigorous. And I said, well, let's see what happens. It was a home run. It was amazing. I was shocked. He showed changes in brain function, changes in brain structure. He showed these kids, this is like 15 minutes 3 times a week of these mindfulness exercises. Their stress is down. Their emotional regulation is up. It was unbelievable. And yet there was the data. And so as a scientist, I'm a show me the data sort of guy. You show me the data, even if it doesn't support what I think, right? I gotta believe it. And then there's been a whole series of studies over the years. This is probably 15, 16 years ago, that have led me to really take this quite seriously. And without getting into the details, these meditators, and it can be something like a simple body scan meditation. It can even be something as basic as sitting silently and focusing on the breath and letting the thoughts that pop up, because thoughts are going to pop up, right? You're going to think about, oh, I should have said this when I was talking to my boss, or I shouldn't have said that when I was talking to my partner, or I'm hungry, or whatever. Thoughts just come up like they're popping out of, a geyser in Yellowstone or something like that. But the key with the mindfulness is you watch them and you say, oh, there it is again. There it is again. I'm feeling like an imposter. There it is. I'm anxious about what might go wrong in my match on Saturday, whatever it happens to be. You don't react to it. You just watch it go by. And what happens, I think, over time is you start to disconnect the thoughts, which are always going to come. They're going to especially come when you're getting ready to walk out onto the court or in the middle of the match when things aren't going your way and you've got to try to shift the power of the balance of power, whatever your thing is. The thoughts are going to come, but what you're doing is learning how not to react to them, not to engage with them, not to amplify them. That's what you get. And the effects outlive the time that you're doing the practice. That's the really cool thing. And we could see it in the brain. We can see a ramping down of this default mode network in the brain that is responsible for a lot of the chatter in our heads and all of these things. So my athletes, I ask them to spend even as little, some of them, it's a hard sell for some of them. Okay. I might ask them, okay, let's start with 5 minutes, 3 times a week. And then once I get them seeing that, oh, they can handle that, we'll ramp it to 10. Progressive overload. It's one of the basic concepts for everything I do, everything any coach does. And it's a really good thing. And I get athletes coming back to me all the time who are reluctant, saying, wow, I'm so glad you got me into this habit.
Is there a specific app that you use or that you prescribe your athletes? The only reason, which one is it?
Well, look, there's a bajillion apps out there, but
There's a lot.
yeah. So some colleagues at UCLA,
Yeah.
at the Mindfulness Center there, put out a free app. And
Oh, cool.
I love advising people to start there because it
Yeah.
doesn't try to sell you anything. It doesn't spam your inbox. It's just an app that these scientists who are doing studies, rigorous studies of mindfulness practices, both on the brain and on behavior, made available to the public as kind of a public service. So people can just Google UCLA mindfulness and it will get them there. And I think there's a version for Apple and Google and whatever else you may need. Great place to start. Very basic
Yep.
meditations, but yeah, then you can. There's a bunch of commercial things after that if you want to go that route.
The reason that I asked that is because to that point, I was kind of hoping
Mhm.
that you led in that direction with your inner circle, because I know that people are going to listen to that and want to be like, "Oh, let me give it a shot." But
Yeah,
like, if they went to a couple of the bigger brands, you got to sign up for stuff, then you got a newsletter, then you got to
yeah.
do a free trial that charges you
Another
afterwards, and
monthly
forget about.
subscription that you
Yeah,
forgot you had. Right. Exactly.
exactly. So if they
Yeah.
can go somewhere simple to try it, that would
Yeah.
be
Go check it
awesome.
out. Go check it out. I think it's great that they did that, and I want to support that.
So transitioning a tidbit here. So
Hmm.
we're gonna still talk about mental fatigue a little bit, but I really wanted to gear it around the idea of failure, right? Because we talk about failure in some capacity
Mm.
on this podcast. It's really
Yeah.
how the podcast started as a whole. And I feel like as an athlete, so I'll speak from like an emotional experience and even like going through it myself, also as an entrepreneur, right? I think everybody in their life, right, fails at something, at least a couple times. You definitely feel it tax on you, not only emotionally, not only physically, but also mentally. So how does failure as a whole, I'll say actually going through failure, impact the brain?
Hmm. So, two thoughts. The
Yeah,
first one is not exactly a direct answer to your question, but I
that's
promise
okay.
I'll get to it. The first is that, if you're not failing, in your sport regularly, you're probably not pushing yourself very hard. You should have workouts that
Very
push
true.
you to that take you to that limit. Not all the time, right? You don't need to be on that edge all the time, but you need to practice that. You need to practice pushing yourself in order to know where that edge is and know where that limit is. And that's a movable thing. We're going to move that over the course of a season, right? If your training plan is working, that's going to move around. That point of failure is going to be lower at certain times of the year and higher at others. That's what we want. We need you to do that, and we need you to fail. We need you to fail in a way that provides that kind of all important feedback about where that limit is. So the answer to your question is more complicated, right? Um, in the bigger sense, failure is a very complicated thing. There is the action that led to the failure and the feedback that's telling you you failed, right? And that's different things in different sports. That could be, in the case of a racket sport like we're talking about, a missed point, right? Or a lost
Mm.
game, depending on the time scale we're looking at. In the case of a bike race, it could be you got dropped from the peloton and spit out the back and you're done. Or it could be even worse. It could be a horrific crash, right? I mean, you can imagine failures at all different levels. Or you failed to meet some goal in the short term or the long term. You know, I have athletes who are want to be in world championships. They want to be in national championships. They want to be in the Olympics. They really have high goals. We all have goals. So that's very much not the kind of thing we could say there's an area in the brain. Now, to take it down to the micro level, when you fail on a pickleball is such a great example. I wish had known more about this because I'm realizing just like how relevant a lot of the things I do are to the fast game that you've described to me. But when you miss a point at pickleball, right? And we're asking you, that's a kind of a failure.
Yeah.
There's an area deep inside the middle of your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. There's a real mouthful. You could drop that at your next party and people will probably go talk to someone else. um, Very effective, I might say. Your anterior cingulate cortex plays many roles, but one of them is an error detection. Ooh, you made a mistake, right? So if we were to put you in situations like, give you some of those funky tasks I had you do in my brain imaging center, we would see the anterior cingulate cortex light up when you make a mistake. And there's all these routes that connect the anterior cingulate cortex to other areas, including areas involved in emotion. And so by failing in practice, we can start to not change the detection of the fact that you failed, but start to decouple that a little bit from the emotional reaction, because that's what gets you in trouble. You look at, as you were saying, there's error compounding. Well, okay, so the anterior cingulate cortex noticed you got an error. Now, other areas of the brain involved in things like fear and anxiety start to ramp up. But if you get to practice in a setting where the consequences of failure are low, right, in training, you get to practice failure, you start to become able to disconnect the emotional reaction from the noticing of the error. The error now becomes an important training signal. And in psychology, there is no learning. For the most part, there is no error free learning. It's always the case that when we're learning new things, we're learning them by making mistakes and correcting our errors. That's the most effective kind of learning. So we want to see the error as a good thing. We want to see it as a training signal. We want to make errors in training and learn from those errors and disconnect the emotional reaction from the failure, if that makes sense.
Total sense. Total sense. And the
Cool.
question that I have following that up, because I think that was a tremendous breakdown, is, and I'm thinking about this from like a biological standpoint, meaning like, why is it actually happening to us? Why do we have the response? Is it really just telling ourselves, like, hey, there is something to change, or like we need to do something differently, or we need to learn something from this? Is that really why we're getting a response like that?
Why do we react? Why does failure have such salience in
Yes,
grabbing us?
exactly.
You know, it would just be like armchair evolutionary speculation here, but I'm not above doing that. So
Yeah.
I'll let you know what I think. Um,
Yeah.
I think that, if you think about evolution and survival and adaptation, um, failure needed to be something that really grabbed our attention, just like pain. Those are two things that really grab our attention and sort of
Mm,
shake us, right? And say, pay
yeah.
attention, focus here. This is serious. Failure could be, falling through the ice and freezing to death. Failure could be, eating some kind of food that you really shouldn't be eating out in nature. Eating the blueberries when you should have eaten the red berries or whatever. Failure could be putting yourself in jeopardy. So we really need to pay attention to it, and I think that's part of it. But what's cool about sport is that, with the exception of like driving your race car into the wall or something like that, most failure is not highly consequential in terms of life or death. Most of One of the beautiful things about sport is that it provides a safe environment for us to experience many of the things that out there in the rest of life have big consequences, right? Things like failure. Failure is such a great example of that. It's okay to fail out there in sport. It might not feel okay, right? We don't like it, but it's an opportunity rather than something to be looked at as needful, in need of being avoided.
Like you said, you have to do it in order to iterate, right? In order to adapt, in order to learn and really get to that next level, that 1%, that half a percent that we talked about. You're only going to get there through failing and then learning and then adapting from that, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm still training and racing bikes. I'm going to be 60
Yeah.
this winter. I'm super excited because I get to move away from the 50-year-olds. And, I'm doing it at a pretty high amateur level, really enjoying it. And I fail workouts, not irregularly because I
Yeah.
choose workouts that really are going to put me on the limit. Not all my workouts for sure, but I'd say maybe once or twice a month there's a workout that I'm really going to push myself to that limit, that I expect to be an important limit to understand for competing well.
This just popped into my brain. When you're writing programs for your athletes, are you sometimes pushing them to failure like you do in the gym where you do as many reps as possible in a period of time?
Oh, 100%. I in fact wanted to push you, at least if we say if we say failure, at least to the point of making errors. I did not
Yeah.
want to just give you tasks you were going to get 100% on. And in fact, you didn't. You
Yeah.
know, every task you had great performances. Your performances averaged between, I think, a low of 84% and a high of like 97, 96%. Super
Mm,
good performances, exactly where I would want someone to be. Your response times are very quick, by the way. You have
that's good
very,
to
very,
know.
yeah, very quick response time. So perfect for the things you're doing. But I always am playing with that. Yeah, I always want people to be experiencing these making errors and failing, because that's where the improvements are going to come from.
Absolutely. So this is going to lead into our final two questions.
All right, because my mental fatigue is accumulating precipitously. If we had a little graph, it's going. "Doo, doo, 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 doo."
So we have two final questions.
Yes.
And I'm going to give you the first one now and we'll get to the last one afterwards. So the first one also has to do with failure. Perfect
Mhm.
transition here. So what is one failure you had in your life that you are now thankful for today?
Okay, give me a second here.
Yeah, take
Um,
a second because I know we all have so many, and
yeah,
you're like, which one?
yeah. Oh, yeah. I could write books on failure, definitely. Um, I am. I'm going to say that when I quit high school
Yeah.
to go to work to earn money to support my mom and myself, there was no small part of that which felt like failure. Like what I'm saying is that it felt like a failure. It felt like, wow, high school. Here I am. I'm not going to finish this. And
Yeah.
it felt like something that had to happen, but it also felt like a colossal failure with a very uncertain um, consequence, right? How would this play out? Right? What did this mean? Would I, what was my future sealed? And in retrospect, why I'm grateful for that, it was a tough situation, and I wouldn't want to replicate the experiment. I was there are a lot there. The odds of that working out the way it has were really small compared to what could have happened. But I think that that's given me this sense of strength and resilience that I otherwise might not have had going forward into my life. And when things get tough, I always look back and say, I got through that. So this is not that bad.
I I appreciate you sharing that because I think the emphasis on your struggles are often your gifts is just a huge perspective and lens to carry with you because it at least lets you remind yourself, like you just said, in those moments when you're in another hole where you're struggling again, to say, I got through this once, I can get through it again. And I love that.
Yeah, that failure was rocket fuel that I'm still running on to some degree, however, 44 years later or whatever it's been.
So we will have to have you on for a second episode to tell us more about that journey, that story, and your life from then until the entrepreneur and the business owner that you are today. So we'll definitely have you back on for episode 2. So we'll tease it there.
I love it.
So the last question that we have, first one is always geared around failure. Second one is geared around fears.
Oh,
So our closing question is always, what is your greatest fear moving forward? You could also take a second to think about that.
yeah, I want a second to think about that.
Yeah.
You're tough, man. I thought I was tough giving you the task. I feel like you're giving me the payback now with existential questions.
A little bit.
Wow.
I was thinking about it
Yeah.
while I was doing all that brain training. I was like, I can't wait to ask him this question.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer it this way.
Yeah.
I'm very committed to my family and my kids, my wife. And my biggest fear would be doing anything that caused difficulties for them, I guess,
Mm.
whatever that might be. Um, I guess it's kind of a fear of failure in a way, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Doing anything to let them down, I think.
The reason that we always ask that question, and you reiterated something that I think was so prominent, is the fact that we all navigate failure and even the fear of it throughout our entire lives, but it never really goes away. It just gets easier to deal with and easier to navigate. So even in your position, like you just said, you've been through so much in your life, right? Highs, lows, and the in between. And some of that is still rocket fuel for you today. But you still have a little bit in the back of your brain that you do have fears of. And I think
Oh,
that is just,
absolutely.
right? Us
Mhm.
being human as a whole.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
no. I think it as irrational as it is. I'm a person just like everyone else,
yeah.
and I have uh, I have the same sort of things where I'll worry. I'll have the recurrent dream of being back in high school, and I've not been there for all these years, and I don't know what's going on, and I'm going to fail the chemistry test or whatever. It's still there. It's still in there.
Yeah.
And yeah, and a big thing for me is not wanting to ever disappoint or let down the people who have been very instrumental and supportive and that I love.
That hits home with me. It does because I think a piece of why we started this entire project was my fear of failure, which came from me playing high level hockey and also like, because I care so deeply about the things that I do and I'm very close with my emotions and I'm heavily empathetic, I cared a lot about the people that I respected, right, and looked up to. And when I felt like I let them down, I felt like my world was just crumbling around me. And so that's why that hits home with me heavily, because that's what I carry every single day now is like, you left your engineering career, right? You left your high paying job and you took a little bit of a risk, and you don't want to let the people down that, whether it's your parents, whether it's your father, whether it's your friends or mentors, like, you don't want to let them down, right? But
That's
ultimately I had to come to the conclusion that if I don't allocate my time to the things that I enjoy and I want to do, I'm going to live a very unfulfilled and unhappy life, right?
right.
So highly worth taking the risk, and I think that you would definitely tell us the same.
Same thing, man. When I walked
Yeah,
away from my tenured professorship, people were looking at me like, is something wrong that you're not telling us? And it's no, actually, everything's right. I just need a new adventure. I need to do this thing. So, I guess another way of answering the question would have been to say that I would fear of regret. I would
yeah.
regret not doing the things that challenge me. And we know from the psychological research that that is uh, that is a really tough thing for people when they regret not taking the risks and the chances. So here we are, man. We're taking the chances. We're doing new things, and we're supporting other people doing that.
We'll close with the fact of, why does regret, from a psychological standpoint, weigh so heavily on us when it comes to that response?
I wish that I could quickly,
Yeah,
reflect on this. Some of the literature on regret, and I had a great professor at Cornell who was studying that beautiful research. But here's what I think as a brain science guy. I
yeah.
think our human brains, are very concerned with trying to predict the future all the time, even when logically it might not be that predictable over long scales. But we're set up. A lot of what the brain does is act like a prediction machine, predicting the future. And I think regret plays somehow into the emotional side of these longer range predictions. We have this desire to have, inherently in our psyche is this need to have goals and aspirations to that we can aim for, that we can kind of predict into the future, that we're going to be our guiding north star. And I think when we have the realization that those are off the table, perhaps because we didn't take the risks, right, to choose to go after them, that really resonates deeply and strikes a lot of emotional chords. That's really a far out winging it sort of answer, but I do think it does have something to do with us, the predictive nature of the human brain. We're always looking
Uh,
forward.
yeah. I mean, I could tell you that from me being me in my own personal experiences. Sometimes it's a blessing and a curse, meaning it keeps driving you forward, but oftentimes it leaves you a little bit stressed about not getting enough stuff done in a fast enough manner too, right?
Yeah. Less so with each passing year, I might add. I think about the things I worried about at your age aren't the things I worry about at this age. And yeah, circumstances change, but so does our perspective of that we acquire through living and making mistakes and failing and surviving.
So, Scott Frey, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
It's a real
If
pleasure.
uh if people want to find you, where can they find you at currently?
Go to my website, cerebralperformance.com. Maybe we could put it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
And yeah, there you can learn more about what I do and who I am there, and you can even send me an email from there. It's just Scott at cerebralperformance.com. But you can do it through the site, or you can do it on your own. And it's been a real pleasure. I love that you were game for doing a little experiment, and thank you for the conversation. It was great.
Yeah, I loved it, and sneaky, tidbit here. We'll definitely be doing some work together in the future, and we'll talk more off the record about that, and we'll go from there. But either way, to find Scott, we'll definitely put in the show notes. We'll put a link to his website, and then there is some literature that he sent me that talks about mental fatigue and how it actually has the impact on physical performance. I'm going to link that as well, so that will take you right to his website as well, and you could do more in-depth reading if you would like to. But either way, Scott, thank you so much today.